I made the decision to homeschool. My wife and I did because we had such a great homeschooling experience ourselves.
Am I saying that homeschool families are all engaged in abuse? Absolutely not. But I'm using that as an example of the importance of having other adults, other professionals, have a sense of what's happening in a child's life outside of the home.
Homeschooling is not really about maybe core religious beliefs. Again, the primary reason that most parents are homeschooling is because of a school safety or environment concern.
For me, the claims that are made from that community, that it's more effective and more efficient, as a researcher, I'm interested in data. And so for me, I would be interested in them putting that to the test.
Welcome to the Michaela Peterson podcast. I'm Michaela Peterson. Happy New Year. Guess who turned 30? This girl. 30. Anyway, in this episode of Opposing Views, where I interview two experts with the opposite opinion on social matters, today we covered homeschooling. This is important right now because the schooling system is iffy right now. I was joined by Dr. T. Jamerson Brewer and T.J. Schmidt. We spoke about home versus public education, curriculum decisions, educational qualifications, the socialization of homeschooled children, factors involved in abuse or academic success, ideology in teaching, CRT, and much more. Dr. Brewer trains educators the best he can for successful careers. He's an assistant professor of social foundations of education at the University of North Georgia and received his Ph.D. from the University of Illinois. His scholarly work has been published in many peer-reviewed journals, including Education Policy Analysis, Archives, and Educational Studies. My second guest is T.J. Schmidt, who was homeschooled starting from second grade through high school. For much of that time, his family served as missionaries in Haiti. He earned his Juris Doctor from Brook College of Law while serving as a legal assistant at HSLDA, where he's now a staff attorney helping with legal questions and challenges around homeschooling. He definitely practices what he preaches since TJ and his wife homeschool their 7 children. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to hit subscribe, and Happy New Year again. TJ Schmidt, welcome to my podcast.
Well, thanks for having me.
Before we get started, can you give a brief introduction about who you are and what it is you do?
Sure. Well, I'm one of the staff contact attorneys here at the Homeschool Legal Defense Association. I've had the privilege of working at HSLDA for almost 20 years. Before that, I was actually homeschooled myself. My parents homeschooled my siblings and I in northern Vermont. And my wife and I currently are homeschooling our 7 children. I've been working as a staff contact attorney at the Homeschool Legal Defense Association, as I said, for almost 20 years. And I have the privilege of serving homeschooling families all across the country, currently in 8 states.
So why did you choose to homeschool your kids?
Well, I think primarily for me, I made the decision to homeschool. My wife and I did because we had such a great homeschooling experience ourselves. Both of us were taught at home. My parents wanted to start teaching me almost really from the get-go, but because of the state laws at the time in northern Vermont, they weren't able to get approval until I was in the 2nd grade. And I was homeschooled from 2nd grade almost all the way up through high school. My wife was homeschooled from 1st grade all the way through high school. Both of us had a really great experience in homeschooling. Of course, we did different things differently than how we were taught at home. We had things that we liked, things that we didn't like. But the overall experience was something that we wanted to be able to provide to our children as well and provide them kind of that same opportunity, the flexibility, just really all the things I think when you think about homeschooling, that when parents make that decision, that's what they're looking for to provide to their children. And that's what we wanted to do.
What are the main arguments against homeschooling?
Well, I think some of the things that we hear all the time are that from parents would be, well, I could never do that. I could never, be with my children all day long. I'm not qualified to teach my children. I wasn't good at math, for instance, or, I sucked at science. So parents have concerns whether they're capable of actually educating their children at home. I think obviously we're still dealing with the whole socialization issue A lot of parents will say, well, if you're homeschooled, you're going to be unsocialized. You're not going to be able to communicate with anyone else. So I think those are some of the things that we typically hear. But I would say all of those very easily have been demonstrated in the homeschooling community to be honestly just false. In fact, if you look at the information out there, more homeschool students are more involved in their community than their public school counterparts in socialization. So that really discounts that issue. When you talk about qualification, parents have the ability to incorporate not only just their own instruction that they provide to their children, but many homeschool parents will use co-ops. They'll use maybe the private school, or even have their child, when they get into high school, go to the local community college. I've had both a son and a daughter take like pre-calculus at the local community college. My daughter's taking some writing classes through the community college. So there's just no limit to who you can use and bring into your homeschooling program. And with modern technology, you can do online classes from all around the world. And so there's really that, I think, eliminates the concerns that some parents have as well. I couldn't really teach that subject. And then as far as the, kind of the big one, I couldn't be with my children all day long. I think, a lot of parents are concerned about that, but I can tell you, you really develop a, closer relationship with your children and as a family unit. I think we've seen that, my older kids are, much more involved maybe in their younger siblings' life than they would be if they were in school 6 to 8 hours a day. And obviously we have time where we need to be separated, and, it's not always going to be, roses, but I think it does provide just a wonderful opportunity to be more involved and engaged as a family together.
Yeah. Strengthening relationships between siblings isn't something I'd considered for homeschooling. So when you're doing your specific version of homeschooling, do your kids learn together, even with the age gap?
Yeah, so I have 7 children, and my wife is a primary homeschool teacher. Their ages range from 17 all the way down to 5. So we have high school senior to a kindergartner. And I think it varies. It varies in families. It varies in our particular family. There are a couple subjects that my wife does teach in group setting. So for instance, science. My kids are learning about migratory birds. And so several of my children, about 4 of them, are together learning about migratory birds. Now, as their age range is different, my wife may give one child a more difficult assignment than maybe the kindergartners is just coloring a picture of birds, or like an Arctic tern. So there are a lot of subjects that can work well in kind of a group study. And there's actually a whole group of parents who will use like unit studies, and where they can teach multiple grade levels. Think of kind of like a one-room schoolhouse in that kind of context. But then, of course, there are a lot of subjects where, depending on the level of the student, they're going to be working more independently and coming to myself or my wife for that individual instruction, like math or maybe English, things like that.
Do you guys do standardized testing?
So each state has requirements on what you must do when you homeschool your child. There are a number of states, about half of them, that do require some type of standardized achievement testing. Personally, we live in a state where we do have to test in the 3rd, 5th, 8th, and 10th grades. And that would need to be submitted to your local school district in our state. Some states do require annual assessments. Personally, my wife and I have just made the decision to test our children every year. Obviously, we want our children to be successful. We want them to be productive members of society. We want them to be able to go out and get a job or pursue anything that they're interested in. And so testing for us helps us evaluate how they're doing. Are they learning what we're wanting them to learn? Are there gaps where we maybe are missing? And I think even in states where you're not required to do testing, in my experience, a lot of parents feel the same way. They want to be able to know, hey, is all the effort that I'm putting into this, is it really working? And, are we going to have children who are going to be successful. They see how they're doing day to day, but they want to be able to, maybe see how they compare with maybe other children of the same age or grade level. And so a lot of parents do test, even though they're maybe not be legally required to do so.
Are there any states where homeschooling is illegal?
So thankfully, no. There's no state there where it's illegal. Back when HSLDA first began in 1983, it was only clearly legal in 5 states. And since that time, really over the early to late 80s, most states, through the hard work of committed, brave homeschooling parents who took the stand and said, hey, we want to be able to have the opportunity to homeschool our children. And locals and state homeschool organizations, and of course HSLDA, working together, we were able to get laws passed or cases won in all 50 states. So the last state was in 1993, and that would have been Michigan, where you had to be a certified teacher in order to be able to homeschool your child. So that, through case law, was defeated back in 1993.
I didn't realize that this was recent.
Yeah, well, of course, homeschooling has been around really since the founding of our nation. I mean, many of families and children who came over as immigrants and settlers early in the founding of the Americas were, at least in part, taught at home. And so you would have had homeschooling really all throughout kind of the colonial period here in the United States. But I think over the early 19th century, you became more of a compulsory education. And so, children were attending public schools more and more. The modern homeschooling movement really kind of took off in the late 70s, early 80s, and just because of a variety of reasons. But that's kind of where the modern homeschooling movement kind of took off.
Interesting. How do you feel about the argument that parents aren't suited to be educators because they haven't been educated in education specifically?
Sure. I mean, that's a very common concern, I think, that we hear a lot. What I would say to that is, well, first of all, particularly in this day and age, as I said earlier, a parent has the opportunity not only to use their knowledge, what they know, to be able to pass on to their children, but really the whole world is before them. And you don't have to rely solely on what you know. And I think most teachers will tell you that the best way to learn is actually to teach. I've known over the years, in fact, one mom in particular that I remember talking to, she didn't graduate from high school, but took on the challenge of homeschooling her children, her 5 kids. After they went all the way through high school, she actually went back and got her master's degree. This was a woman who never graduated from high school, but through the learning experience that she had in educating her children, she grew to have a love for education, and went on to get a higher degree of education. The thing that I would say is that, I think the number one most important thing when homeschooling is really that commitment or desire. Homeschooling is not easy. It's not necessarily for everyone, but I think anyone can homeschool regardless of their educational background. And there's a lot of research out there that has actually looked at that specific question. If you have a high school education, if you have some college, or if you're postgraduate degree, how is that going to impact your child's learning in a homeschool environment? When you look at public school statistics on this information, there's a huge gap. You can actually track how a student's academic expected outcomes are based upon the educational background of their child in public school students. And the gap can range 30 to 40 percentile points in standardized achievement tests. When you look at homeschool students, that is less than 5%. The gap between someone who has no high school, hasn't completed high school, and someone who has maybe a postgraduate. I think the key factor is that parental involvement. Most of us are homeschooling because we want our children to be successful. We don't want our children to, not be able to get out and, get a job. I like to tell people that, I don't want, my child 40 years old living in the basement. I mean, of course, they would be welcome to live with us, but, I want them to be able to go out and have their own life. I want them to be able to be successful and pursue something that they're interested in. And so regardless of our academic or educational background, when you make that commitment to homeschooling, if this is something that you're desiring, you're wanting your child to be successful, I think there's plenty of opportunity for you to be successful, regardless of what your personal knowledge in in any particular subject is.
Have you heard the argument that people homeschooling their children are going to end up in some sort of echo chamber along with other homeschoolers?
Yeah, I think there are some people who believe that, homeschooling is very insular. I think the fact of the matter is, you're not, when you're homeschooling, you're not in a log cabin in the middle of the woods somewhere. There's very few people who are, that remote. My parents began homeschooling in northern Vermont, and we lived, pretty far from the road. It took me almost an hour to get to the school, riding on the school bus. That was one of the reasons that my parents made the decision to homeschool us, because here I was spending 2 hours a day almost just getting to school. And so we had much more of an opportunity to homeschool. But getting back to your question, I would say that, homeschoolers have the opportunity to expose their children to all different points of life, all different perspectives. I want my child, not to be ill prepared for living. And I think if you look at the research and the studies, homeschoolers are actually more involved in their community than their public school counterparts. On average, homeschool students participate in 4 to 5 activities in a general week. I mean, I'm thinking of my own children. My wife and I were actually talking about this the other day, trying to get a date night in, and we have to plan around all the activities that our children are doing, whether it's strings orchestra practice, whether they're participating in a co-op program, whether they're involved in flag football or soccer, or all these other activities that they're involved in, engaged in. They're exposed to people and things constantly. And we also have the opportunity to talk about current political events. Sometimes I think my kids are too involved in knowing, what's going on politically, at their young age. But, we certainly have the opportunity to expose. And most homeschooling families that I know, they're exposing their children to all those things. So again, I think it's a perception issue that most people just think, well, this is what they think of when they think of homeschooling: log cabin off in the middle of the woods, no electricity.
Okay. Is it true that people who homeschool on average make more than people who aren't homeschooling?
Well, there is some research on kind of the income level, but I would say on average, that's not true. The statistics and information that you see out there point that on average, most homeschooling families are a one-income family. And so they're oftentimes making do with less than some of maybe their neighbors are. That's a sacrifice and a choice that they've made. But, you've seen an increase, or we've seen an increase in homeschooling just all across the board. In fact, minority families are coming to homeschooling at significantly higher numbers. And it really makes no difference on your socioeconomical background, on the academic achievement of your child when you're homeschooling. It's the great equalizer. And so I think that on average, homeschool families are not as well off as their neighbors. Again, primarily because they're making that sacrifice of generally being a one-income family.
Okay. Have you heard of the types of schools where it's kind of combined, where you do some homeschooling and some school?
Sure. Yeah. So, there's a lot of names for that. Sometimes it's called co-ops or hybrid homeschooling or pod schooling or flex schooling.
Mm-hmm.
There's just a lot of different names. And I think it really speaks to the fact that homeschooling, you have a wide range and flexibility in how your educational model is. Growing up, my parents, we were entirely in the home. My mom was the primary teacher, and we didn't participate in any co-ops. In my own family now, we participate in a co-op 1 day a week, where the children are taking classes with other homeschooling families. Homeschooling moms or dads are the primary instructor in that particular class, but like they're taking Spanish or physics or some other subjects that in a group setting, it's maybe perhaps a little bit more unique of an opportunity for the kids to learn in a group setting. And so with co-op, you can do that. I've already mentioned community college. A lot of high school students, homeschool students, are going or taking community college classes. And really, I think homeschooling speaks to the flexibility that you have to do that. Not every parent has the ability to spend 5 days a week homeschooling their children. And so a lot of pod schools have kind of sprung up in COVID, where maybe one day they're at the Smith's house, another day they're at the Jones house, another day that the Rodriguez family. So there's just a wide flexibility. And most state laws require the parent to be the primary person responsible for the education, but they don't necessarily require the parent to be the only one who's providing the instruction. So you have that flexibility. And I think, because of COVID, we've certainly seen an increase in more hybrid type homeschooling programs, but they've always been out there.
Interesting. So how old do you have to be to attend a community college course? Is that in person or is that online?
So that really depends on your local community college. I've had, some states actually have dual enrollment programs where homeschoolers are entitled to participate. For instance, like Florida. With a community college in their local school district, they have an articulation agreement that determines the age of the student, minimum age. Some of them have a minimum age of 15 or 16. Our local community college does not have a minimum age. As long as you take the placement test and you score a minimum score, then you can take any dual enrollment class that you want, regardless of your age. I've helped kids get into college as young as 12, 11 years old. So there's really no limit on how old you have to be. It's highly dependent upon the community college and, of course, the student and their academic ability.
That's very interesting. I don't know much about Canada's system for homeschooling, but I don't think it's like that. I don't think it's as... Do you know anything about it?
Well, so there is an HSLDA of Canada, and so they have local chapters in all the different provinces, and we can certainly connect you with HSLDA of Canada later, but I don't know off the top of my head what their options are as far as like dual enrollment.
Maybe my parents were just lying to me as a child. No, you have to go to school. Homeschooling's illegal. Anyway, I don't know. Who decides? Okay, so you said, I think we covered this already, but curriculum's decided by the state. How strict do you have to be with that when you're homeschooling?
So I would actually say that curriculum is not determined by the state. What in the United States, the Supreme Court and a number of even state constitutions prohibit the state or the government from controlling what curriculum content in private education. There's a number of really important Supreme Court cases dating all the way back to the 1920s that have specifically said that no, the state cannot dictate to you as a private education, whether it's private school or homeschooling, what you must teach. Now, the Supreme Court has said that, yes, a state can mandate that a child is educated, that they are literate, that they are self-sufficient, but the state can't specifically say, no, you've got to teach this textbook or this curriculum. So most states, what they require is that you teach subjects. You have to teach math, you have to teach science, social studies, and so forth. And they, of course, can require that. But it is up to the parent in the homeschooling program what they are actually using to teach that particular subject. Now, in some states, you do have to provide a list of the textbooks that you're providing. So for instance, in New York, you have to provide an individualized home instruction plan form. And in that, you have to list the textbooks or the curriculum materials that you're using or your plan of instruction. But the state, the school district doesn't have the ability to determine, no, you can't use this textbook, you can't use that textbook. They can only verify that, are you teaching subject? Are you teaching math? Are you teaching science? So no state in the United States can actually dictate what specific curriculum.
But they do dictate what curriculum's taught in public schools.
Yeah, absolutely. When you're sending your child to public school, then generally the state dictates the state content standards that are required to be taught And then often on a local level, the school district is in charge of picking particular textbooks. There are a number of states, obviously, that have their recommended textbooks for public schools, but usually the local control, at least in most extent, is the school district level. The parent, of course, has very little control over the curriculum content of the public school. They could obviously run for school board, or they could voice their opinion at the school board meetings, but ultimately that responsibility is either from a state content standard requirement or the local school district level on actual textbooks.
Is it expensive to homeschool?
So generally, most homeschooling parents spend on average between $300 to $500 per child. And of course, you could spend less or you could spend more than that. I think for our family, we spend, with our 7 children, we spend maybe $2,000 total to homeschool all of our children. Now, there's a lot of things that, we are purchasing every year, but there's some, books that we may purchase once and we can use for most of our children or all of our children. So there's a lot of, a lot of parents will say, I couldn't afford to homeschool my children. I can't, I'm already paying taxes. I've got other expenses, food, of course, gas right now. They just can't afford to homeschool their children. But I would say you can homeschool regardless of your budget. There's a lot of free resources out there that you can get. A lot of homeschool support groups actually have lending libraries where you can actually loan out used curriculum. There's used curriculum markets and sales that they have. Even your local library, has a lot of resources and information that you can use and incorporate into your homeschooling program. So on average, again, $300 to $500, but you can spend a lot less. And of course, you could certainly spend a lot more.
Okay. I know that there's a good portion of my audience that's being concerned about public schools, specifically about ideologies being kind of taught through them at the moment. So a lot of people are pulling their kids out because they're saying, I don't want teachers teaching ideology to my little kids. So what's your view on, I guess, the dangers there? And is that avoided in homeschooling because curriculum isn't as mandated?
Well, so I think in a homeschooling environment, again, I think most of us are homeschooling because we're interested in our children's education. We want to be invested in what they're learning. And as I said, I think most of us are also, trying to expose our children to everything that's out there, but maybe in a way that we feel is appropriate to them based on their age or, appropriate to our family philosophy or maybe our religious faith. And so I think all of those things are key factors into reasons why parents, make the choice to homeschool. I think within the homeschooling community, you have a wide range of both curriculum that you can choose from. There are some parents who use the same textbooks that their public school uses. It's just that maybe their child's in a bad environment. The school environment's not good. They're getting bullied, or maybe they have a physical, handicap or mental handicap. And they're using the same curriculum or textbooks. And you have the freedom and choice to do that in a homeschooling program. But also because you have that flexibility and freedom to choose other curriculum, you can use something that aligns maybe with your philosophy, your religious beliefs, in a way that's still providing the necessary required instruction, but is maybe dealing it on a more sensitive level. We've seen a huge increase in minority homeschooling. In fact, the U.S. Pulse survey that came out just recently, 5 times the amount of Black homeschooling families. It used to be about 3% of the homeschooling population. Now it's over 16% of the homeschooling population. And one of the main reasons a lot of Black families are saying, my child's not receiving a good education, or they're not being treated in a way that I believe is proper, just a racial tension within the school, or they want the flexibility to be able to provide a more diverse curriculum to their children. They want their children to, not only just learn about Black History Month, but they want to be able to provide, their children with a wider range of and diverse, instruction that they couldn't receive in the public schools.
Okay, I think that sums up about everything I want to talk about. I guess I could also cover one of the concerns that I've heard would be around religion at home. So what if people are bringing their kids out of public schools and then not teaching them things like evolution? So do you have any views on that?
Well, so if you look at the reasons that parents are homeschooling their children, the number one reason is actually school safety, school environment. That's over a third of all parents are actually, that's their main reason. If you look at it, religious belief is probably number 4 or 5 on the primary reason. So I think that that's really, the very few people, that's a fundamental reason that they're doing it. But I think, again, you have the ability to provide your children with a wide range of education. And I think most of the families that I know, they're providing their children with all views, just in the context of their family, in the context of maybe their fundamental, worldview. But we have families who are homeschooling from Muslim families, Christian families, secular families, atheists. Homeschooling is not really about maybe core religious beliefs. Again, the primary reason that most parents are homeschooling is because of a school safety or environment concern.
Okay. Well, is there anything else you want to address? Actually, before we stop, where could people potentially go to find more information on how to get this done or how to bring their kids out of school?
So the first thing that I would say would be they can go to youcanhomeschool.com. We have great resources on that website. If someone's considering homeschooling, they want to know what their state law requires or how do they even begin homeschooling, they can go to youcanhomeschool.com and find out a lot of information. Here at HSLDA, one of the key things that we do is help educate parents on what state law requires, help them get prepared. We have consultants. We have special needs consultants, high school consultants. We can plug them in with a local support group. I think when you're making that decision to homeschool, it's really important for you to get plugged in with a local homeschool group where parents, you can talk with homeschooling parents who've been there, done that. You can compare notes on, hey, what curriculum might work good for my child? And I think it's just, there's a lot that goes into making a good, successful homeschooling program. And we do everything that we can to help parents have that successful homeschooling program. So go to youcanhomeschool.com and you can find all the information you may need there.
Okay, so last question. Another concern brought up is maybe some kids are being kept at home because they're in some sort of an abusive environment. And so homeschooling is a cover for that. How do you feel about that argument?
Well, again, I would say that as a parent, my primary concern is my children and their well-being. I want them to be successful. I want them to have a good academic foundation. I want them to be able to go out and do everything that they can. And I would say 99% of all parents who are homeschooling their children, that is their primary concern. And who can be better concerned for their children than the parent? And so I think any view of child abuse or neglect is reprehensible to me, and I think to the vast majority of homeschooling parents. No one wants to see a child abused, and we're doing what we're doing because we love our children. We want them to be successful. I think, unfortunately, there is child abuse, whether it's in a public school, private school, or homeschooling. And I certainly think that the government responsibility is to, find and catch those situations. I don't think that there's no research out there that says that homeschooling is more dangerous for child abuse. In fact, if you look at child abuse statistically, it is more frequently occurs in a public school environment. Not only are others involving in child abuse, maybe in the home, but also in teachers. And then over 20% of all students, public school students, say that they've faced unwanted abuse from peers in the public school environment. And again, I think that speaks to, the primary reason that parents begin homeschooling is because the safety concerns, whether it's bullying, abuse, just context. In fact, I just spoke with a mom just 2 weeks ago. Her 8-year-old son was coming home crying because he was being assaulted and bullied at the school. He had bruises over his body. Mom talked with the public school and said, hey, this is going on. This needs to stop. and she just grew frustrated. They didn't do anything. They couldn't control this issue. And she took it upon herself to homeschool her son because she couldn't see him abused anymore in that system.
Okay. Thank you very much for coming on. If people want to find you, is there a place they should go other than the website you mentioned?
Yeah, so they can also find us, give us a call at 540-338-5600, or they can visit us online at www.hslda.org.
This podcast is sponsored by BetterHelp. Let's be honest, everyone needs help at some point in their lives, some more than others. Reasons may vary wildly, but that doesn't change the fact that no matter where you are in the world, BetterHelp is available and ready to lend a hand. BetterHelp matches you with a professional therapist in under 48 hours. You can log into your account anytime and send a message to your therapist. You'll get timely and thoughtful responses. Plus, you can schedule weekly video or phone sessions ahead of time. It's easy to see why over 2 million people use BetterHelp. It removes all the potential hassle and awkwardness and gives you the same end product in a few simple steps. Their licensed professionals are categorized by specialty on the website, making it even easier to match with one. If, for whatever reason, you're not satisfied, it's also super easy to try a new one. BetterHelp wants you to start living a happier life today. Visit their website and read their testimonials. BetterHelp is also more affordable than traditional offline therapy, and financial aid is available for those who need it. They have a special offer for my listeners. You can get 10% off your first month at betterhelp.com/Peterson and join over 2 million people who've taken charge of their mental health with the help of experienced professionals. In fact, so many people have been using this service, that additional therapists are being recruited in all 50 states. That's BetterHelp, as in HELP.com/Peterson, or just use promo code Peterson for 10% off. Hope you enjoy the rest of the episode. Dr. Jameson Brewer, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So before we get started, would you mind giving a brief background about who you are and what you do?
Sure. So currently I'm an assistant professor of social foundations of education at the University of North Georgia. And what that means is I teach courses to pre-service undergraduate teaching candidates. So these are folks who are training to become teachers in the K-12 world. I myself, having once served as a K-12 teacher, I taught 7th, 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th grade history and social studies.
Yikes. How was that?
It was unique. 7th grade is scary. They're going through a lot of changes, and it's unique is the best word I can give to that. But high school was certainly much more comfortable for me. I enjoyed that.
Okay, so I brought you on to talk about homeschooling in particular, because from what I've read, more and more parents are pulling their kids out and homeschooling. So I have a bunch of questions to throw at you, but to begin, what's your overall view on that, but homeschooling in particular?
Sure. So broadly conceptualized, my research and academic and scholarly work is situated in the question of privatization of K-12. And that takes on a lot of different forms, school vouchers, charter schools, but homeschooling, right? And so homeschooling is the sort of quintessential iteration of school choice. And it's also one of the oldest forms of schooling in general. Since the beginning of man, parents have been teaching their children at home how to survive and various other things. For me, when I think about this question of my view of homeschooling, it comes back to, of course, my own experience as a K-12 teacher, as someone who currently trains future teachers, as a parent myself. My spouse is also a K-12 teacher. It comes down to a question of what do we consider to be the importance of education, and to whom should we leave that to? So there are lots of questions, and I'm sure we'll get into it in our conversation about parental sovereignty. But there's also some questions that should be raised about what it means to be a professional educator. And is this process of education or schooling, is it something that as a society we conceptualize as something that ought to be overseen and delivered by professionally trained individuals? Or is it something that is either not that important or is the process of teaching and child development not a science, not a profession that could be done by anyone, and in this case, a parent.
So what do you think about that?
It's a great question. I'll give you two answers to that. As I said, I'm a former teacher. I train teachers now. My wife is a teacher. We have two children, ages 7 and 6. Both of our children attend public school. I think that you can imagine that we might be qualified to teach our children at home. But having the qualifications and experience that we have in education, we know full well that we are not qualified to provide a holistic and purposeful education to them across the myriad of subjects that students learn in schools, across the myriad ways that schools allow students to socialize. So for me, and sort of making actionable my view on homeschooling, as a parent, I have the option to homeschool, and I have specifically chosen not to homeschool because I don't believe it to be the best way, at least for me, in our family, to go about the education of our children. To the question of whether others should or should not, obviously that's a question for them to answer. But again, it raises the question for me of this idea of whether teaching is something that anyone can do, and that you need, and if you're homeschooling, you need not be trained in how to do that in pedagogy and child development, lesson planning, and the specific subject area knowledge. And when I start down that road of questions, I find less and less convincing arguments that would support homeschooling.
Okay. The origin of schools, with like the size they are and the classroom size, were they not designed to kind of create factory workers to get people into that mindset?
So the short answer is yes. A more complex answer is that not all schools have been that way. Certainly schools that tend to more affluent families, more affluent areas have long eschewed those sorts of approaches to education, right? And that's a conversation to be had. But you're right. For the masses, schools were designed to train students to work in factories. We have ringing bells, schedules, and things like that. And to be clear from the very outset of this conversation, my critique of homeschooling or school vouchers or charter schools or things like that should not be understood as an across-the-board endorsement for how we've done education. I think that there are room for reforms and improvement within the public school space. So it's not all of this or nothing. But yeah, that's what schools were designed for. Certainly, we don't operate really in that type of economy anymore. And so it needs to be updated. It needs to change. And it has very slowly. But again, in more affluent areas, this is not something they've dealt with. The schools were designed for a different purpose, and they've served that community well over time.
Given the kind of influx of people bringing their kids home and homeschooling them, do you think there should be government guidelines stopping people from doing that or encouraging them to go to school more than they already are?
Yeah, so in almost every state, it's exceedingly easy to opt into homeschooling, whether that is simply filing a letter of intent, and in some cases, really almost nothing. The question of government oversight, regulation, right, if that's what we want to call it, is something to be discussed, and for a couple of reasons. As I'm sure we may discuss claims of effectiveness, whether homeschooling does better or not. So much of what we know about the homeschooling community is from self-reporting. And that's sort of by design, right? I mean, these are communities that have made a conscious decision to withdraw from sort of the public space in this area and some type of government oversight, from the local school. So we really don't know much about what's happening other than what's being reported. We do know a few things that when COVID happened and schools shut down or moved to fully digital, there was a 50% reduction in reporting suspected cases of abuse and neglect to the authorities. That usually happens as a result of schools. Am I saying that homeschool families are all engaged in abuse? Absolutely not. But I'm using that as an example of the importance of having other adults, other professionals, have a sense of what's happening in a child's life outside of the home. And so if we operate on the assumption that homeschooling will continue to operate and maybe even grow, for me, the claims that are made from that community, that it's more effective and more efficient, as a researcher, I'm interested in data. And so for me, I would be interested in them putting that to the test. I do think that there should be some, whether it's a counselor, educator, somebody with some professional training and background, to have once a year, twice a year. I'm not exactly sure what that looks like, but some sense of what is being taught, how it's being taught, whether the children are being taken care of or not. And, to be honest, a significant portion of the answer is going to be yes, that things are great and the children are well taken care of. But obviously, in some cases, that might not be the case. And I do think that as a society, we've clearly collectively made the decision that all of us as adults, and myself as an educator, I'm a mandated reporter, that we have an obligation to look after children who cannot speak up for themselves. And so, yes, I do think that there should be some intervention, regulation, oversight. You can pick the word that you like, but currently the way that it's operating on also cannot be sustained.
Okay, so let's start with this. What have you seen from your research about the efficacy of homeschooling versus public education?
Yeah, so those are generally, so we have rationales for homeschooling, and those generally, not always, but they generally fall into religious category or political or curriculum-based category. But the sort of justification on the back end is that it's more efficient and it's more effective. And by effective, I mean that it produces better academic outcomes. And again, returning, that's troubled a bit by the fact that the data that we have from homeschooling families is self-reported. And so from the beginning, it's a little bit problematic because there's not a lot of incentive for homeschooling families that are struggling and academics are not going so well to report that to anybody. And so it's likely that some of the data is a little bit biased towards the positive. But even with that, we know we have the benefit of knowing that many homeschool students are not homeschooled K through 12 exclusively, that they may start homeschool in the early childhood grades and then transition into public school, middle or high school, usually as a result of the parent recognizing their sort of lack of more advanced content subject knowledge. Or going in and out. And it could be based on the family moving around, maybe a military family, whatever that might be. But we know that that students who are homeschooled generally, and again, it is self-reported data, but generally they do better than their peers in public school. But we know that they do better whether they are in homeschooling or in the public school. And so from a research standpoint, what that tells me is that it's not necessarily the treatment, it's not the mechanism of schooling that they're receiving, but it tells me a little bit more about the sort of background that the child is coming from. Homeschool families, roughly speaking, make as a household income somewhere between twice or three times as much as the typical or median household income in the United States. And we've known since the 50s. We've known since the 50s that how much money parents make has a direct impact on the academic outcomes of their children for lots of reasons. They can afford books, they can afford trips into museums and things like that. And so the fact that they do well, and by they, I mean the homeschooled students do well, whether they are being homeschooled or in the public school, tells us that it's perhaps not a result of the homeschooling and more so a reflection of the economic realities of that family.
Why would people who earn 2 to 3 times as much decide to pull their kids out of public school to homeschool?
Well, from the very easy answer is that they can afford to, right? To the question about efficiency and the cost associated with homeschooling, It's generally you will see organizations say, it costs $600 or $700 a year to homeschool your child at home, and they're usually reporting the cost of buying some books and some sort of curriculum subscription. But they're leaving out the reality that it does require, generally speaking, the opportunity cost of one parent giving up a salary. And so for a lot of families, and again, not all, but for a lot of families who homeschool that do operate from a one income household, that one income is exceedingly higher than the median single income across the country. And so they do it simply because they can afford to do that. But it does generally come down to the typical rationales of religious rationale or some type of political or academic rationale.
How do you feel? One of the arguments put forth by people who are pro homeschool, I would say, is, or anti homeschool perhaps, is that socialization is an issue if you're homeschooled. Mm-hmm. So what are your views about socialization in regards to homeschooling?
Yeah, so the sort of stereotype for generations has been that homeschooled students are not socialized, and that becomes a problem for them when they move into adulthood or when they come to university. In some cases that might be true. Me personally, I think that it tends to be an overblown stereotype, because exceedingly, even within homeschooling communities, I think that they recognize, and maybe it's not just to fight off the stigma of their children not being socialized, but in recognizing the need to socialize, a lot of homeschooling communities have developed networks for their children to engage with one another throughout the day, throughout the week, whatever that might be. I certainly think that that's better than not having socialization, and I don't imagine anybody would disagree. For me, though, I think that the broader question would become back to that question of what is the purpose of education and schooling? And if we can agree that we're no longer interested in training students for work in factories, but that education does still serve a larger purpose to prepare children to enter into adulthood and enter into our society, it does raise some significant questions for me for a homeschool family that is engaging in some type of social activities with their children with other homeschool families. And not just by the nature that the homeschool, but it's far more likely that they're operating within a sort of echo chamber, a bubble, whether it's an ideological bubble, whatever that might be. And whether that's an ideology, a political one to the left, to the right, or religious ideology, I think most of us can understand that that's not how society works. And if we understand schooling and education to be preparing children for that, it becomes problematic for me for anyone to suggest that socialization within an echo chamber or an ideological bubble is beneficial. To the contrary, public schools, by their very nature, tend to be more diverse from viewpoints and backgrounds and religion and whatever that might be. And for me, it represents a greater opportunity or more aligned opportunity for children to become socialized into what society will be for them as an adult than sort of recoiling away from that into our little corners, whatever those corners might be.
Okay, I would say, just from speaking to a few people who've been homeschooling their kids, that part of the reason they pulled their kids out was because they felt that public schools were becoming the ideological echo chamber. So how?
Yes. Yeah. So that, and of course, anybody paying attention to the news in the past, 6 to 10 months, that's a conversation. The Virginia governor's race was not single issue decided on this, but played a significant factor in the outcome. The problem is, I'll say this: for public school to engage in curriculum, with few exceptions, that is generally overseen by a school board, which is democratically elected. And so parents, and whether they're parents or just local tax-paying citizens, have a voice, have a say-so in the process, the curriculum, the design of their local school, by its very nature. Being disappointed, being disgruntled, or being misinformed about what curriculum might be or what it might not be is a problem, right? And social media has certainly exacerbated a lot of these things. But to give you an example, right? The current example is CRT, but a sort of historical example, and specifically within the homeschool community, might be something like evolution, right? This idea that evolution is being taught in the local public schools, and a lot of families will opt to homeschool because for ideological or religious reasons, they don't see an alignment with their child being exposed to the theory of evolution. So it's not a new idea. It's not a new concept that parents have taken issue with the curriculum at the local school, or that they've opted to homeschool because of that. But again, for me, and with the example of evolution, I would take it back to the question of what's the purpose of schooling and education. Having a child learn about the theory of evolution is not by its design intended to force a student or encourage a student to throw off their cultural or religious identity. It's a theory, and it has been adopted in science. And through that process, in the preparation for children to enter into society as an adult, we may collectively agree that having that shared sense of knowledge is something that's important, whether or not they go into work as a biologist or whatever that might be. But it does become problematic, and I say this as a parent as well, if I conceptualize the local public school curriculum as something that I could or should be able to sort of a la carte pick what I like, what I don't like, because again, that raises the specter that I am more of a content expert, more of a pedagogical expert than the educators in the local school or the broader school district.
So would the example of evolution be compared to the current teachings in CRT?
I think that parents' fears, founded or unfounded, about CRT, about evolution, about sex ed, which historically is also a sort of a topic that encourages a lot of families to homeschool. Again, it comes to the question of, should education be a sort of pick and choose a la carte, what I want my child to learn and what I don't want them to learn. But also in understanding that if I homeschool, if I choose to do that, that is an all one thing and none of the other, right? So if I pull my children out of public school, it is none of the public school and all homeschool. Having children be in the public school space, by comparison, does not preclude parents from sharing their own worldview, their own ideological or religious worldviews with their children. And so for me, being in the public space represents the opportunity of a this and that, as opposed to this or that. And again, I think that a lot of it comes down to fear, uncertainty about what a particular subject in the curriculum might mean for a student, what the rationale or motivation for that topic to be in the curriculum might be. But those are questions that the parents could ask and should ask. And for me, I would encourage them to ask those questions and be in a conversation with their school board, with their local school teachers and leaders, as opposed to the sort of withdrawal from that system and that process into their own echo chamber, where it might be more comfortable maybe for the parent. But again, it comes back to raising some significant questions of what that might mean for the child when they become an adult themselves.
Do you think it's possible that people earning 2 to 3 times the average income actually do know how to teach their kids better than the public system?
That's a good question. So I'll just use myself as an example again. I probably make more than the typical individual. I'm not talking about household income, but it comes down to this question of what does it mean to be a professional educator? And I think that the problem in the United States is that because all of us have gone through education, most of us fancy ourselves as experts in education. And I tell folks, if you don't believe that, next time you're checking out at the grocery store, ask either the person in front of you or behind you if there are problems in education and how to fix them. And they definitely have answers for both of those questions. So for the logic to hold true, at least in my view, it would have to hold true in other contexts. This past year, my daughter was riding her bike and fell off and skinned her knee. A minor, small abrasion. And this is not a function of my income, but I felt competent enough to know to not use hydrogen peroxide, to use rubbing alcohol and clean it and apply a bandage. And it generally was fine, and she healed just well. But comparatively, if my daughter had fallen off of her bike and broken her leg, say broken her femur, compound fracture, the bone is through the skin, would I, in the same situation, given the same background, training, the same income, would I feel competent and qualified enough to tend to her injuries? And the answer, I think, for any of your viewers would be obviously not. And we also know that if I did pretend or fancy myself as qualified to do that, I may come under trouble for neglect for my child if I don't seek medical attention for her in that particular instance. So is somebody who makes enough money qualified? I don't know that that's I don't know that a good answer to that question should follow in the sense of if it's not true across any other area of child development, it's probably and likely not true here in education. Just having money does not make one an expert in how to deliver content, how to engage in pedagogy, or understand child development in such a way that lessons are age appropriate, and not just in the content sense, but even how the child brain understands hypothetical questions or it doesn't. These are things that professional educators learn in their training and through experience, and at least in my view, makes them exceedingly more qualified to deliver education to children.
Probably doesn't teach things like CRT either.
At home?
I mean, if you make more money, it doesn't mean that you know about that either.
No, yeah, absolutely. I myself have a doctorate in education policy. I never once had a class in CRT all the way through graduate school, and so I have a general understanding of what it is, but I by no means an expert in CRT.
Where did you get your education?
Sure. I did my bachelor's degree at Valdosta State University, and that was my initial training to be a middle to high school history teacher. I did my master's at Georgia State University and my Ph.D. at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign.
And what year was that, if you don't mind me asking?
Of course. I graduated with my Ph.D. in 2016, my master's in 2012, and my bachelor's in 2007.
Okay. And so you said what you do now is basically educate people on how to educate people.
That's right. So my students are, most of them are sophomores, and as an undergrad student who are taking a sequence of courses prior to applying for entry into the College of Education. Of course, that would be a subset of the university itself. And so I teach courses on critical and contemporary issues in education, educational psychology, and things of that nature.
Okay. And you said you haven't come across CRT, or that's not being taught very much from what you've seen?
Yeah, throughout my entire coursework, I did not take a course on CRT, and that's certainly not anything that we teach current training teachers. As best as I understand the formal groundings of CRT, it's something taught in law schools that stemmed from the early 90s. I don't know exactly when the theory sort of became a thing, but it was certainly in the early 90s.
Okay. Do you think some of these potential problems with homeschooling, could be ameliorated with just compulsory testing every so often?
Maybe, but that raises some questions about the benefit of testing in general, right? Doing more testing for the sake of testing, whether it's in public school or homeschooling, is generally not good education. It's not good pedagogy and teaching, right? It sort of creates the environment in which you get teaching to the test. And to some extent that has existed in public schools, right? So again, I'll remind your viewers that I'm not giving an across the board a non-critical endorsement of public schooling either. I think that it could be part of it. We do know that a lot of homeschool students will take the SAT, for example, and usually for entry into university. It can make it easier for the application process for a student who's been homeschooled to enter into university if they have a more standardized point of reference. But we also know that SAT scores are highly correlated with family income as well, right? So we do know that homeschool families or students do generally do better on the SAT when they take it than their public school counterparts. But again, for me, that's more of a reflection of their sort of home economic background than it is the type of education that they have received. I think that having check-ins, and again, I don't know, and I don't pretend to know, what frequency that might be if homeschooling would continue for academic considerations for the general well-being of the child. Those considerations as well. Those would be important policy conversations to have. But again, of course, the easier solution, as it were, would be to encourage attendance at public schools, as opposed to creating new mechanisms of oversight for a process that may or may not have a real rationale for existing.
How would you encourage more attendance to public schools?
I think it's conversations with families. Generally, if you ask most Americans, at least in my case, tell us your sense of how public schools are doing. If you ask them to grade their local school, and this is true whether they have a child in that school or not, they generally will give the local schools that they live around an A or an A-, but generally a favorable grade towards the local schools. But then if you ask them about the schools over there, right, across the district, across the state, across the country, they will rank them as a C all the way down to an F. And so what that tells us is that collectively as a society, we've really bought into this idea, this notion that public schools have failed and they're bad. But when you ask local folks, tell us about your local school, they like them, right? And so that's a more meaningful and telling artifact of the actual state and nature of schools, is that folks who are engaged in understanding of the local school, again, whether they have a child there or not, tend to be very favorable towards that school. I think that the media has certainly played a role in hyping up, the sort of myth of the failed school, and that informs how we feel about other schools. But it's hard to feel that way when we're able to see the school. It's easier for me to develop a negative view of how schools might be in say, Nebraska, because I don't live there. And so I can just get on social media or the media in general and hear that schools have failed and just take that at face value. I think that we need to have conversations about the realities of schools, the benefits of public schools, the downfalls that need to be attended to and fixed, but collectively fix that together as opposed to pulling away from that possibility, because public schools do represent the best opportunity that we have to provide all children with an equal opportunity. We know currently that they do not. We know that schools that serve dominantly white students receive $23 billion a year in additional funds than schools that don't. That's a problem. That's a conversation to have. So they're not living up fully to the possibility of providing an equal opportunity, but going in the exact opposite direction certainly won't get us any closer to public schools realizing that potential.
Okay. Let me see. What else do I have here? Okay. Are you aware of how curriculum is decided for schools?
Yeah, so generally speaking, that is a decision by either a statewide governing agency, a board of regents, or state superintendent. Different states have different phrasings and words for that. Local school districts have some autonomy in that decision and that process as well. And then down to the local teacher. The teachers are prescribed a very specific set of standards that must be taught. It does, I can say, as a former history teacher, it does generally feel overwhelming to try to teach so many standards in so little time, especially with the increase in preparing students for standardized tests that may or may not even be connected to that content. But as a local teacher, you have some leeway in not necessarily what's taught, but how it's taught, right? We understand that teachers are the experts and they're the professionals in the classroom, but there's a system in place from the teacher to the local school board to the state apparatus that makes those decisions. And the benefit of public schools is that at every level, there's public input, right? Whether that is in deciding who is the state superintendent through an election, or even if that's an appointed position, say by a governor, people having say so in who that governor might be, to the local district and even to the local school with the principal and the teachers. At every point, there's an opportunity for public input and public oversight, as it should be. Whereas other types of school delivery, whether it be private schools or the epitome of it in homeschooling, there's little to no public oversight into what curriculum is taught, how it's selected, and how it's delivered.
You mentioned private schools there for a second. So is there a major difference between public schools and private schools in regards to what they're being taught?
Yeah, and just speaking on that note, public schools have full autonomy in their curriculum, in their admissions process. A private school that is religious in nature can have a litmus test on a prospective student fitting within a very specific understanding of a religious denomination, or to whether they're accepted or not. Certainly, that's not allowed in the public school space, but to the curriculum space as well. Private schools represent an autonomous body that make decisions about student entry, student discipline, hiring, firing, and curriculum all on their own with zero outside or public oversight.
Interesting. Okay. Well, I think that covers what I wanted to ask you about homeschooling. Is there anything else you wanted to mention while you're here?
Yeah, thanks for that opportunity. Again, I would conclude, as it were, reiterating this question or this notion of how do we as a society conceptualize education and the importance of it. And if it is something that we conceptualize and understand to be of vital importance for children, for their development and their lived realities, both as a child, but also in preparation for adulthood, is that something that warrants a space where they go to engage in that process with trained professionals? Or is that something that anybody can do, and in the case of homeschooling, that their parents can do? Is having a high school diploma, good as it is that sufficient for teaching children, not just kindergarten, but all the way through advanced trigonometry as a high schooler? Those are some important questions to ask. Again, as a society, we generally would not condone parents choosing or electing to provide medical care for their children or firefighting care for their house, right? Sort of pulling away, asking for their tax money back from the local fire department. Those are not things that as a society we would really allow or be okay with. And so when it comes to education, the fact that we are readily okay with that for children should raise some concern. But again, it gives us the opportunity as a society to think through what does it mean to educate a child? And if that is an important process, should we, and at least in my view, we should, rely on trained, educated professionals to do that? with the opportunity for parents to be engaged in that process, whether that's through the political process of speaking at local school boards or running for a local school board, or just in conversation with their teachers. It does take a village to raise a child. We need to understand that. And it seems to me that public schools represent the better opportunity to engage in that process than a child being kept at home.
Okay. Thank you very much for coming on. If people want to find you online, where can they go?
Yeah, I have a website. It's tjamesonbrewer.com. And my Twitter handle is the same. It's at tjamesonbrewer. And through there, you can connect with me in myriad ways.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Let me say, Michaela, I appreciate the invite. I appreciate the conversation and the questions that you had and giving me the opportunity to be long-winded on some of them.
No
apologies
problem
to
at all. No. That was good.
Great. Thanks, Michaela.